Pastel is ideal for drawing realistic fur, but the question is, how do we do it? In this video I'm going to explain all of these things plus tips and tricks for beginners. Now let's get started.
Materials used.
For this video I'm going to use soft tools, makeup brushes, blending stump, pastel pencils and of course paper.
Plus pastel sticks.
You don't need to have all of these expensive brands, you can work with whatever you have, but I really recommend those because they are a very good quality.
I will use some masking tape to create a square in which I'll make a first study demonstration. Because brown is almost the most common fur color, I will only use this tint. I chose to draw in a small area like this to familiarize you with the techniques and the steps I'm going to use.
Don't worry, because later on I'm going to show you all of these techniques and methods on a real commission of mine, which is right beside me, and I'm going to do it on a whole area of this portrait. So watch until the end.
We will start with creating the base layers. Base layers are the foundation of every drawing, and if they are done well, they are going to help you a lot later on in the drawing. They need to be created bit by bit until you get the contrast and the shade you want. I use pastel sticks for this step because it is much faster, but you can also use only pastel pencils, but as they have a small tip, it will take some time to cover the whole surface.
Something very important to keep in mind when drawing with pastels is to add the base layers gradually. Don't add all the powder at once on the paper because you're going to fill in the texture of the paper and won't be able to add any layers on top anymore.
It's best to start with the darkest shade and gradually work your way up to the lightest, but as this medium is so versatile, you can add light over the dark and the other way around. The most amazing ability of pastels is how easily they can be blended.
If you notice that the powder left behind by the pastel starts moving around, try to use your finger to blend. This is going to give you a smooth effect in the end.
Just by adding a bit of pigment while applying only light pressure with a blending tool, I immediately blended and created a new color. The base layers act as a guide and also as a map. They will show you where light and dark fall on the drawing. When you'll add the details, you will immediately know where each color belongs just by looking at the base layers. Just as hikers need a map and a guide, we artists likewise need something to guide us and make our job easier. Another important role of the base layers is to cover up the texture of the paper and its color as well. I honestly feel much better when I do a drawing and when all the base layers are done, because I cover the paper and it looks like I have gone very far with the drawing, but it is just an illusion because what I really did was just to add some layers of color, but my eye perceived this as a big step. As I just said, this mistake of applying too much pigment will basically ruin your whole drawing. Luckily, this can be easily fixed by using a kneaded eraser and gently dabbing the area and picking up the excess pigment. The surface won't be the same as before, but it will give you the chance to add another layer or two, which is much better than nothing. I almost always use my fingers to blend towards the end of creating the base layers to give the surface a perfectly blended look. But before you do that, make sure you don't have any excess sebum on your fingers. Adding details. After working hard to create the base layers, it's time for some fun. Although it's essential for me to create the base layers, it's not really my favorite part, but adding the details is the icing on the cake for me. I started by marking the direction of the fur to make sure it didn't look wrong in the end. I chose a fur pattern where the fur goes in pretty much all the directions to show you that this matters a lot in achieving a realistic result. In a drawing, you'll never have fur that is going in the same direction throughout the whole drawing. That would give the artwork a flat and fake look. Focus on the reference picture and make sure you follow the same direction as there. As you can see, I'm following the map I made before, this with the base layers.
To get the most realistic and defined fur strands, make sure the pencil tip is always sharp.
Exactly. Having a pencil with a sharp tip will make the pencil strokes look like fur and not just like thick lines if not sharpened. Because the pastel pencils have a dusty texture, they will wear out very quickly and you always have to keep an eye on the pencil tip. The pastel paper has a sandpaper texture, which eats up a lot of the consistency of the pencil. This fur pattern was purely from my imagination, and I just let myself be creative. Unlike color pencils, with pastels you can very easily and quickly create realistic fur. You can add a light pigment on top of a dark one, and vice versa, which opens up a whole other world to obtain a realistic result.
To avoid constantly sharpening your pencils, try rotating your pencils while drawing the fur. This is going to keep the tip sharp for a long time without any sharpening required.
This is the easiest way to save a lot of time, but you can also use a piece of sandpaper to give the tip of the pencil a quick sharpen. I always spin the pencil automatically because it's just my reflex now. I've been doing it for so long now that I don't even think about it anymore. At some point, the tip will be so small that even this method won't work anymore, having to sharpen it at one point, but quality pastel pencils can be so expensive sometimes that you want to use every piece of them as much as possible. Leaving the strong highlights and shadows to the end is ideal to bring the whole drawing to life. You can notice that just by adding a few strands of white fur, it gives the drawing a glowing effect in just a few seconds. These things also contribute to a realistic end result. They add a dimension to the drawing. A strong shadow shows how low that layer of fur is, and the white highlight how high. In the end, creating a 3D effect, which is what we all want. If you don't like the way the fur looks, you can simply blend that area with your finger or other blending tool and start again. The traces of the old fur will no longer be visible at all, giving you a blank canvas for a new start. When applying a more prominent color, such as black, I first take a look at the fur structure as a whole and search for some gaps between the already drawn fur to give it some contrast using a black pencil or another darker color. This is of course in addition to the dark areas marked at the beginning of this video with a dark base coat. This step will make all the areas to look connected.
Now, the time to show you all of these techniques and methods on a real commission of mine has come, and I'm going to do it on a larger area of this commission right next to me.
I want to demonstrate how I'm building up the base layers and add fine details on one of my commissions. Since before we worked on a small area, we will now move to a much larger section. When the area is bigger, of course the first strands will be bigger too. My opinion is that it is much easier to create realistic fur on a large scale than on a small one with pastels. A big advantage is that you don't have to put too much thought into having a sharp pencil tip all the time, because the hairs will be as thick as the pencil tip when you draw on a larger scale. Creating the base layers, this time on a bigger section.
When working on a larger area of a drawing at the same time, it's best to apply all these techniques over the entire area all at once. For example, add the base layers everywhere until you're happy with the end result, then add the details on top by starting out with marking the direction of the fur, also over the entire area.
By taking each large section of the drawing separately and applying the same methods throughout, will significantly increase the completion time of the drawing. Applying the base coat over a large area has several benefits. The first would be that you are much less likely to use excess pastel powder and to float the texture of the paper with dust. With a larger surface area, there is also more room to spread the pastel as much as possible. No pigment applied with pastel sticks or pencils will ever look the same after it is blended. It will always look lighter afterwards, that's why it takes several layers. I used a very inexpensive makeup brush for this step. All I wanted to achieve was to mark those places to get a general idea of how everything looks overall and if it's the right place to place them. In this stage, you don't have to worry at all about the direction you apply the pastel on the paper. After it's been blended, you won't even see any traces, which is another thing that makes drawing fur realistically very easy with this medium. Keep in mind also not to press too hard on the pencil, especially in the early stages of this step. In the case of this drawing of the Dalmatian, it was the easiest for me to first start with a white base layer all over, then mark where those black areas specific to this breed would be located. Once I was sure they were in the right place, I added a black base coat to them as well. Better a little at a time and leave room to fix the mistakes than lots at once and maybe give yourself more work afterwards. Make sure that, before you apply a very dark base coat, that you are completely finished with that lighter base layer and that you add all the necessary tints before that. If you try this after you've put a dark pigment on the paper, you run the risk of pulling that pigment into the light layer and blending them together, which won't look very great. Adding details. Drawing Dalmatian fur will be the easiest option to draw realistic fur if you are just starting out, since it has so many black areas that usually have only a few white or gray fur strands over. It is ideal for beginners. What you should try to achieve is to make it look like those black fur dots are tied into the rest of the drawing and also attached to the white fur, because you don't want them to look like they're just glued on the white fur. This is a very important thing in all kinds of types of fur. You always have to look for a way to connect all the colors together and not to create a transition too sudden between the colors. This also helps a lot if the steps before that are all done correctly. I go back a bit to the base layers now. If the transition between the base layers is smooth, also when you apply the details with the pencil will look smooth as well, and the fur will look realistic because what you see under the pencil strokes are those initial base layers. That's why I keep telling you that this step is very important for later on in the drawing. What many beginner artists don't keep in mind when learning to draw realistic fur is the outline of the drawing. In the case of the Dalmatian I'm drawing now, the outline is very sharp in correlation with the background because it has very short fur, and the light reflecting of the white fur makes the hairs not very visible, but if you draw a long or semi-long furred animal, many of the hairs will be visible in the background as well, as a kind of rebellious hairs that give the illusion that the subject is in the foreground and the background in the distance, which gives also a 3D effect to the drawing. If you don't add this important detail, it will look like the animal you are drawing is glued to the paper and not part of everything that is going on behind him. This principle also applies to drawing whiskers, but that's for another video. Paying close attention to how the light falls on the subject can also change the drawing radically and also the end result. Don't be afraid to use white where you see the light hitting very hard and black where the shadow is placed in the reference picture, because you have a lot to lose. Usually, people don't look at each individual strand of fur, but only as a whole, how the complete artwork looks as a unity. If you use the right contrast, you'll definitely have a realistic drawing in the end. The beauty of pastels is that, no matter how dark and strong a color is, if you apply something lighter over it, it will show right away. This should be used to our advantage. The final touches are the icing on the cake of the drawing. This helps to finish the artwork, usually by adding some highlights here and there. But be careful not to get carried away. It's possible that the fur will look great, and when you start adding these final touches, you'll go overboard and ruin the whole thing. Too much of a good thing sometimes spoils it. We all want to add more highlights to a drawing because it brings it to life, but in some cases, we have to get a grip and only go by what we see in the reference picture. In short, what you should aim for when drawing fur is to use the right colors, have good base layers, make sure the pencil is sharp and leaves thin lines on the paper, use black and white to create a strong contrast, and most importantly, don't rush because haste makes waste.
Leave adding the strongest highlights and shadows to the end as a final step. You want to use your darkest black and the whitest white at the end of the drawing. These are also known as the final touches.
Take it easy and give yourself as much time as you need, because the paper and the pencils won't run anywhere. They will always be there, so why rush?
Thank you so much for making it to the end of my video. I'd love to hear what you think about it, so if you'd like, leave a comment and tell me what you think. If you liked my video, please subscribe and press the bell button to be notified every time I post a new video, and I really hope I'm going to see you in the next one as well. Have a nice day wherever you are, and see you soon. Bye!